take a close look at this guy right here. This is a 1970s era Johnson 3-cylinder 70 horsepower motor. And even back then, they had an individual coil per cylinder and case reed type induction where they have reed valves and one carburetor set for every cylinder. There's a later version. Another later version. This one has oil injection. And here's another one of those 3 cylinders. Just a really slick design, you know, for the time period. And they made good power. I mean, they really did. Of course, they got the V6 in the back of the Checkmate. That's a runner. And if you look in the back of the garage, there's a couple of the inline 6s, which are my personal favorites. And they've come a long way. I mean, my God, in the 60s they had a distributor type ignition. And then by the time they got into the 80s, they had gone way past that into what you have now. You know, the stators, the switch boxes and stuff like that. You know? And this is a Snowmobile engine. It's a water-cooled 3-cylinder. Kind of like the outboards are water-cooled 3 cylinders. It's more in line with what you see on a motorcycle. And it has expansion chambers because there's plenty of room to do that, where the outboards usually don't have expansion chambers. But if you look at those tuned pipes, just think about it. One of the advantages of like the motorcycles and snowmobiles in this case is they have the room to put tuning devices like that they have on their 2-strokes in order to get more horsepower. Chainsaws are limited by weight and size, more so than something like this machine right here. Now that's a 3-cylinder that was built in the mid-90s, and if you were to look inside those cylinders, you'd see Swiss cheese for ports because they knew how to make horsepower by that point in time. Now it's a water-cooled engine versus an air-cooled engine. Like the outboards being water-cooled, having that ability to rid the system of heat gave them a lot more latitude in being able to put horsepower into the motors. It's kind of like the 800-pound gorilla. Most of the chainsaws are air-cooled, and they're both weight constricted because you don't want to have a heavy saw, size constricted because you don't want to carry around this big box. So things like tuned pipes and water cooling are not really practical. And even more than that, with the chainsaws powered the way they are now, they make enough horsepower in the size configuration that they currently are, where they don't need all that stuff. And this last couple of years has been a learning experience for me on the old chainsaws. 10 years ago, I guess 12 years ago, I was introduced to the old metal John threads like the 920s. Bob and I started hunting them down and putting them together. And they're cool old saws, you know. And what I want to do is just sort of run through the years just a little bit and kind of give you an idea of the changes that happened in the chainsaw design from, say, the 60s up until the 80s, even the 90s. And kind of like with motorcycles, it kind of stabilized. It got to a point of diminishing returns where instead of the layout being changed, it was other technologies like, you know, fuel injection, or in this case auto-tune and stuff like that for emissions. But the basic layout of the saw, the practical nature of the saw, the power to weight ratio and stuff like that kind of was stabilized by the 90s. So running through the years, let's start with these. This is one of my favorite saws of all time. It's a Homelite 925, and the basic design was developed in the late 60s and ran all the way to the 80s. So this was sold parallel to a lot of the saws I'll show right here, just because it was a big, heavy, industrial chunk of metal that cut wood and cut it pretty well and reliably. This thing here is like 17 pounds. It's a heavy saw, 20 pounds plus with a bar and chain on it. But it's been reliable. I've run this for decades, this one right here. Never really lets me down. The only thing that happens to this is once in a while the metering valve sticks on the carburetor, so it won't start. but once I knock it loose or tap the carburetor, it'll fire right up. But these were case reed designs, so they had a reed valve. The carburetor went into the case itself through the reed valve, and the cylinder design on these was like this, where you had a lot of finger ports, a fair amount of fin for the displacement. That's your exhaust, but the carburetor goes right into the case itself with a reed valve arrangement. With a case reed induction, you can get that low end power, that torque at lower RPMs, a wide power band, and I guess if you design the port timing right and the cylinders right, you can get RPMs out of them. Look at all the dirt bikes and the race bikes that did that. But these were designed to be just big, powerful, strong saws, run day in, day out, and they did. And pull big bars, it does. You've seen my videos. A couple of things that I like about this saw is the fact that the exhaust is over here, not blown into the work. We've talked about that before. And it's relatively easy to work on, and it's just been really reliable. This one here doesn't have an automatic oiler. You have to pump the oiler. That came later. And but the basic controls and the layout of the saw are timeless. You know, it'll do what it does probably another 15-20 years from now. Excellent old design, heavy, you know, but definitely reliable. The Swedish saw builders started doing a little different layout, and I guess it wasn't just the Swedes, but basically in Europe you had that vertical cylinder with the mufflers up front, carburetor up here, airbox, and piston port designs. So instead of having case reed like this one right here, where the carburetor is in the case, the crankcase, you have the carburetor in the cylinder itself. This is a piston port, and the timing of this saw is defined by the piston itself. That's what opens and closes that intake. Versus this, with the case reed, it's just based on pressure differentials in the bottom end. You know, when the piston goes down, the reed valve slaps shut. When the piston goes up, there's a pressure drop and it draws air. This right here is pretty typical of the Husqvarna and John thread saws of that era. And if you look at it, it's a very similar layout to what you see all the way up into the 90s, even now. So, while this is fairly common and the design layout started somewhere in the 60s, ran right through the 80s, this Husqvarna was like a mid-1970s design, 74, 75. This is a model 77, so it's 77 cc's. I'm going to try to get it started today. And the layout of this saw is pretty familiar to the people who run saws now. Muffler, vertical cylinder, piston port where the airbox is up here. It has very, very, very rudimentary anti-vibe. But this saw right here is a 2000s era John thread 2171, and they still sell a 372X torque, which is the same basic cases and layout. The two's got that vertical cylinder, muffler, airbox, carb. The big difference here is that instead of having the oil and the gas in the cases, you got the bar oil in the case, but you got the gasoline separate in the handle, and there's an anti-vibe system. Now we've covered all this before. Cylinder-wise, in that class of saw, you had this style of cylinder show up in the 90s. You know, instead of having the two transfers on the side, you've got the 4 quad port, and then now you have the X torques. That's a whole different game. I've covered that, and this is about emissions. And these are a little heavier and taller and all that stuff, and it wasn't so much about the practicality of the saws, it was about emissions. And they run good, you know, it works. But the layout of that saw isn't a whole lot different than this one right here. This was introduced in 1978 So you have the 1960s, and by the way, the gas and the bar oil is in the same case. On this one here, it's just got that horizontal cylinder layout and the case reed induction system. Mid-70s from Sweden, from Husqvarna. Very similar layout, but instead of having a separate tank and handle arrangement, the gas is in the same case that holds the cylinder. So the cases have the gas and the bar oil. Where this one here, the big difference is the handle is separated out with anti-vibe, plus the gas is held in the handle separate from the chainsaw cases. So on this layout right here, 1978, that's when this one was built, is, like I said, it's pretty much the same as they are now. Now for John thread, this is a model 80. So I've got three 80cc saws here, in the sense I've got a 77cc Homelite, a 77cc Husqvarna, and an 80cc John thread. And the big difference between this one and that Husqvarna, the anti-vibe on the John thread is quite a bit more sophisticated. Now this is a lighter saw, so if you're looking for pure simplicity and lightweight, between these two 80cc saws, that Husqvarna is a more compact and lighter package. And but this one has the anti-vibe rubber bushings in the handle, a little more substantial design. It too has the gas and the bar oil in the chainsaw cases. Of course, this one has the gas behind and the bar oil in front of, kind of like an intermediate step between that and the gasoline in the handle. I want to see if I can get all three of these 80cc saws started today. John thread layout was actually earlier than even the Husky. The first John thread with that layout was a 621 that I know of. There may be more, but the 621 came out in 1970. And this came out in like 74 or 5. From my notes, that Homelite, the first one that came out in 1966. The model 77 came out in 1974. And the John thread 801 and 621 came out in 1970. That's what I have right here. So you're seeing all these saws that were sold alongside each other in the 1970s. And obviously Homelite lost the battle. John thread lost the battle. They got bought out by Husqvarna. And then, but this basic layout that started with John thread, Husqvarna, and possibly some others, I think I saw solos like that as well, really is the genesis of what we see today. But what I want to see if I can do today is see if I can get them started. Because I really want to get some saw work done, I did include my model 70E. This is the newest of the saws that I have right here I'm going to use. Mid-70s, late 70s, late 70s, 60s. Let's see if I can get this started. that's a little more than I wanted. There we go. All right. Let's see if it restarts. I'm curious to see if it'll restart. Let's see if it restarts after a couple of minutes here. It does. It's just got a lot of compression, so it's hard for me to snap it over. And the more I ran it, just like the John thread, the better it ran. Point being is, an old saw like that that's been sitting for a while takes the carburetor a little bit of time for the diaphragms to start working well, and for the ring, the reseat in the cylinder and things like that. Sometimes it takes a little while for the seals to swell and seal up in the bottom end as well. But so this is a Husqvarna model 77. It's an L77. I have an L65 at the shop as well, so you know, we'll decide what to do with those. My first impression is this right here, as compared to the other saws of this era, this one feels like a modern saw to me. Throttle response is right there. The power is right there. I know it's 77 cc, so it should, but it's surprisingly strong, and it has surprisingly good throttle response, and I like that. And for an 80 cc class saw, it's really not that heavy. So just goes to show they've been making really good saws for a really, really long time. Beautiful day out. I got kind of tied up doing other things, but I've got about a half hour to an hour to come out here and do a little more work in the hedgerow. I want to chop, there's a down tree in there. It's a honey locust, and it makes some really good firewood. And I'm trying to get the firewood out to where I can get to it. And I might sell some this year. I mean, I'm pretty far ahead of what I expected, which is a surprise. But I've got a Widowmaker right there, and I got some in there. And I want to clean this up a little bit so I can get through the hedgerow in multiple places, so I can get in here with a tractor and a trailer and get firewood out of here easily. Right now it's just a tangled mess, but it gives me an opportunity to play with some of my vintage saws, because you know, it's not so much about how fast you get it done. You know, it's about quality of life and having fun. And I ran this one a little bit. This is that Husqvarna L77, and it ran pretty good. So its biggest problem was whoever decided to sharpen that chain has no gullet at all. There's no, that's never going to cut good. So I'm just not going to have time to grind on it right now. I can fix the chain, but I'm just going to put this one on right now. I've got this off one of my 65cc builds, the 48 millimeters. So I'm just going to do that. There's no gullet at all, so it doesn't really cut very well. This goes into that whole thing about living with a saw. How hard is it to change bar and chains? In the John threads, one of the reasons I like them is because they've got the internal clutch, external sprocket, right? Where that Husky has got the other way around, where it's got a external clutch, internal sprocket. You know, guys will argue tooth and nail about the merits of one concept versus the other. Interestingly enough, even though this is a really, really old saw, yeah, that bar is pretty burred up. It's not going to cut good. And see how easy that was to take off? Yeah, that clutch is shot. I've got to come up with a different clutch. But kudos to Husky, because there's all kinds of space behind here, behind that clutch, in order to get a chain on relatively easily. So that's, even though I don't prefer this style of clutch, the implementation they did on this saw is actually quite good for, you know, working out here in the field. You know, doing what we do. So let's see how this is going to play. This chain's not the best either, but it's certainly better than the other one. getting dark. Got some of that broke up. Let me get up and out of here while I can still see. So that's what a L77 does with a dull chain, because that chain is really dull. Both chains I had on that saw are dull. So that's not fair to the saw. I'll have to get a chain sharpened up for it. I'll do that probably tomorrow. Well, it's a little too dark to see, but my takeaway is on this darn saw right here, it deserves some more time. It deserves another life. It's a lot lighter than I would have anticipated for an old saw like this. And it has a very quick throttle response for something of this age and that kind of an ignition system. It runs pretty good. You know, I was going to argue with Bob a little bit, but I'll lose the argument, because that feels to me like a more modern saw. Even though it doesn't have the anti-vibe, which is the dividing line for Bob, the way the motor operates, the throttle response, the kind of power it has, makes me realize that, you know, for a very, very long time, very, very good running saws have been available, because this is a really good running saw, you know. Now, I intended to do the job with my newly modified Husqvarna 77 modified with this. So I did what they said, and I put a knot in there and put it in there. Second pull out, pulled it right off the string, and the string zapped into the pull start. So now I got to pull that thing apart, you know. See the beginnings of that design. I don't know if that's an open or closed port cylinder. Actually looks pretty clean in there. So let me see if I can salvage this mess. Oh, look at that. Look how fancy that is. Instead of a knot. I don't think I've ever seen something like that before. It's pretty clever.
Try this again.
And then see if I can't wind this thing up, or it'll go all the way in. modified hot saw. And I think we're going to get it to run a little tomorrow. Set that chain up a little different.